All right, let's dive into this one. Saddam Hussein.
To really understand Saddam, we have to go deeper, see how he was able to gain so much power in Iraq, the complexities of his rule, all of that, and then, of course, what ultimately led to that 2003 invasion and, well, everything that came after.
Exactly. So maybe let's start at the beginning. His early life.
Yeah, good place to start. It definitely wasn't a typical childhood. Born back in 1937, lots of poverty and violence from a very young age.
Yeah, the text says his father died before he was even born, and then his stepfather, apparently pretty abusive.
It's really hard to say how much those early experiences shaped him, But it's got to have some impact to grow up in a place where it feels like you constantly have to watch your back, where power and brutality are just the norm.
Yeah. You have to wonder, did all of that kind of plant the seeds for, well, the ruthless way he ruled later on?
It's certainly possible. I mean, look, so the Ba'ath Party was big on Arab nationalism and socialism. Their whole thing was a unified Arab state, social justice and all that. And, for someone like Saddam, growing up when he did, times were really turbulent, lots of political upheaval, colonialism. Their ideology probably spoke to him, a stronger, more independent Arab world, and maybe, just maybe, a path to power for a young guy with big ambitions.
And then there's that whole assassination attempt, the one on the prime minister in 1959. I mean, that's intense. Saddam was involved in that, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's what forced him to flee to Egypt. Exile. I mean, that can change anybody. But for Saddam, it seems like it was a period of, serious learning, strategy. He was really getting deep into politics, networking, figuring out how to not only survive, but manipulate situations to his advantage.
Wow. A real crash course in underground politics.
Yeah.
He comes back to Iraq a few years later, and then by 1968, bam, he's part of a successful coup. He was definitely putting those lessons to use.
Oh, yeah. Ruthlessly. He was rising up in the ranks, getting rid of rivals, consolidating his power. And then, well, by 1979, he was the president of Iraq.
So he gets to the top.
Yeah.
But how does he go from president to, well, a dictator with absolute power? What were some of the tactics he used to really lock down that control?
Saddam, he was a master of control. He built this whole system to make people afraid, to force them to obey. And it started with this insane security apparatus, multiple overlapping intelligence agencies.
Oh, wow. So everyone's always being watched, you never know who's listening.
Exactly. That's the point.
Yeah.
A total chilling effect. It was way too risky to even think about speaking out against him, let alone actually doing something.
It wasn't just surveillance. He brought his family into it too, right?
Right. He put family members in all these key positions, built this inner circle you couldn't break. I mean, think about it. Your whole family is tied to whether the regime survives. Their loyalty is, well, pretty much guaranteed. Classic dictator move. And it worked for him.
So you've got the fear, the loyalty, the family ties. But what about anyone outside that circle? Anyone who posed a threat?
Saddam didn't mess around with threats, real or imagined. Potential rivals, gone. Just like that. The message was clear. Oppose me, and you're done. And to make sure he was in total control, he nationalized the oil industry. Now he had direct access to all that wealth.
Ah, the oil. It's everything in that part of the world, isn't it? Control that, and you've got incredible power.
Exactly. He could hand out resources to whoever he wanted, buy loyalty from important tribes, solidify his power base. It shows that control isn't just about brute force. It's about using money to make people stay quiet and do what you want.
It's pretty smart in a messed up kind of way. But it wasn't just force and money, was it? He also knew how to use image. Propaganda.
Oh, he was a master at that. Cultivated a full-blown cult of personality. The state-controlled media was all Saddam all the time, portraying him as this godlike figure, almost like a modern-day Nebuchadnezzar. Billboards, newspapers, TV. His image was everywhere.
So he's rewriting history.
Yeah.
Connecting himself to these powerful ancient rulers of Mesopotamia, that's got to be effective. Makes him seem almost invincible.
Totally. He understood that power isn't just about, being strong. It's about controlling the story people believe, shaping their perception, and he was brilliant at it, at least for a while. Now, to really get how he played things on the world stage, we need to look at two major conflicts, the Iran-Iraq War and that Kuwait invasion.
Yeah, those were definitely defining moments for Iraq and Saddam's global image.
The Iran-Iraq War was brutal. 8 years of fighting from 1980 to 88. It all started when Saddam decided to invade Iran. Lots of different things went into that decision. He saw their government as unstable after the revolution, thought he could exploit that, plus always the desire to increase Iraq's influence.
And that's when he used those chemical weapons, right? Just horrific.
It was. And the international response? or lack thereof, that's a whole other story. What people often forget is that the West actually supported Iraq during this war.
Wait, seriously, they knew Saddam was using chemical weapons and they were still backing him.
It's complicated. But yeah, a lot of Western powers, the US included, saw Iran as the bigger threat at the time. The spread of the Islamic Revolution and all that. They were willing to overlook some pretty terrible things to counter what they saw as a bigger problem.
It makes you think, doesn't it? How these global alliances and politics play into everything. And then, a few years after the Iran-Iraq War ends, Saddam invades Kuwait.
Yep. 1990. Iraqi forces storm right in. He wanted that territory, and he definitely wanted their oil. It was a bold move. Some might even call it reckless. And the world reacted quickly.
Operation Desert Storm.
Yeah,
The U.S.-led coalition, right? To push Iraq back out of Kuwait.
that's the one. And while they won, militarily speaking, Iraq was hit with crippling sanctions. Isolated Saddam even further, devastated their economy. The Kuwait invasion was a real turning point. It cemented Saddam's image as, well, a rogue actor on the world stage.
Yeah. So even though those two wars had different motivations, different outcomes, it all kind of builds on itself. Saddam's seen as unpredictable, dangerous, and that, I'm guessing, lays the groundwork for what comes next, the lead up to the 2003 invasion.
Exactly. All that mistrust, all that suspicion, it set the stage for what was to come. So we were talking about those wars, right? Iran, Iraq, Kuwait.
Sure.
They really solidified Saddam's image as, well, a dangerous guy, unpredictable. And on the world stage, that kind of sets the scene for what comes next.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, a huge part of the lead up to the 2003 invasion was that whole thing about WMDs, weapons of mass destruction. The Bush administration, they were saying Saddam had them, and that's why we needed to go to war. But now we know that wasn't true at all.
Right. One of the biggest intelligence failures in, well, probably ever. And it really makes you wonder, how did that happen? Was it, I don't know, just a bunch of mistakes? Or was it, well, something more intentional?
This text, it points out a few specific ways that intelligence was like manipulated to fit that WMD narrative. You know, we touched on the aluminum tubes, the whole mobile labs thing, and that nitrouranium situation. But were there any other examples that you found particularly, I don't know, glaring?
Well, curveball, for sure. This Iraqi defector, he was claiming to have all this firsthand knowledge about Iraq's mobile bioweapons program. His testimony was like the smoking gun, the proof that Saddam was actively building these WMDs.
Yeah, curveball. I remember hearing about that back then.
Yeah.
But if it was so important, what happened? Why didn't it pan out?
It turned out later, everything he was saying, totally made up. And not only that, it actually went against other intelligence reports they already had. I mean, from the start, people were worried about whether he's even credible.
So why give him so much weight? If they were already suspicious, that seems like a major misstep.
It's all about context, really. Don't forget, this was right after 9/11. The U.S., I mean, everyone, was still reeling from those attacks. There was a ton of pressure on the Bush administration to do something, to look strong, to prevent another attack. And inside the intelligence community, well, there's pressure there too, to deliver evidence that backs up what the administration's saying.
So it's like this perfect storm, all this political pressure, this desire to find anything to support the story they're already telling, even if it means ignoring the problems, ignoring the warnings from other people within the intelligence community.
Yeah, pretty much. And that brings us back to the media. Did they do a good job? Did they push back on what the administration was claiming? Did they give enough space to different points of view? I mean, weren't they supposed to be the watchdogs, you know? Holding those in power accountable?
From what we've discussed, it doesn't really sound like it.
No. Sadly, a lot of outlets, they were just relying on official sources, quoting these administration officials, but anonymously. Not a lot of fact-checking, not much critical thinking. There were some exceptions, of course, some journalists, some publications who were asking the tough questions, challenging the narrative.
This text mentions Knight Ridder, which I think is McClatchy now. They were doing some good reporting, standing out for being skeptical. What were they doing differently? And why weren't more outlets doing the same thing?
Knight Ridder. Their reporters, they were doing the real work, talking to people outside of Washington, questioning the official story. They weren't just taking the government's word for it. They were looking for proof, doing what good journalists are supposed to do.
But if they were on the right track, why didn't their reporting change anything? It's like it didn't even make a dent.
Hard to say, really. Maybe they just didn't have the same, I don't know, reach as the big guys, the big media outlets. And maybe, well, maybe people didn't want to hear it. The public, maybe even some in the media. That skepticism, challenging the story everyone was being told, it wasn't what they wanted. Especially after 9/11.
It makes you realize how tough it is to speak out sometimes.